Okay, last time we looked at the pause, as it were, between the seal judgments and the trumpet judgments. We saw that the angels were preparing the trumpets and that there was silence in heaven, that the prayers of the saints were presented before God, and then this bowl was filled with fire and thrown to the earth as a sign of judgment. And we looked at several examples in the Old Testament where the same thing symbolizes the coming judgment. We've seen so far that God is all the time postponing, you could say, or waiting, because he wants people to repent, to come to him, to see the seriousness of the situation. And every time we see also that the judgment or the plagues, that they increase. And we will see this now again. We're gonna now look at the trumpet judgments, or plagues you could call them, in the same idea as with the Egyptians, that were also plagues with the same purpose. Actually, it's like a foreshadow of the end of the age. We are going to look at the first 4 trumpets. Obviously there are 7, and we see with the 7 trumpets the exact same pattern as with the seals, which means you have 4 and 3, and they differ. The 4 first seals were these 4 horses. They were different than the last 3 seals. It's like a separate group. With the trumpets, it's exactly the same. The first 4, they are different than the last 3. And also we saw that between the 6th and the 7th seal, there is a kind of pause, and there are events happening in between. With the trumpets, it's exactly the same. Between the 6th and the 7th trumpet, there are intermediate events happening. So there is a pattern in which God apparently works that we can recognize. And these first 4 trumpets, the judgments, they affect natural objects, things of the natural world, like the earth, the trees, the grass, the animals, the water. So everyday elements, you could say, even the light of the stars and the sun and the moon. And maybe you remember in chapter 7, if we go back in the first 3 verses, John sees in his vision 4 angels. He says, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth. Just to bring it back in memory, the 4 winds, we've also looked at this in the Old Testament. Winds it's also a term for judgment. So they are holding the judgment that God has for the earth. And they're holding it so that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. So here you see that the elements of the world are mentioned. The earth, the sea, the trees, the vegetation. And that is exactly what we now will see in these trumpets. That those are the things that will be affected. And then there is in verse 2 of chapter 7 this other angel that cries with a loud voice. It's almost like a last, just before they unleash this, he cries with a loud voice to stop, to wait, because first the saints or the servants, bond servants, have to be sealed. And that is what we saw in chapter 7. And in verse 3 it says, "Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees." So here you have again these elements, "until we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." And so this indicates that these servants, the specific group that is mentioned here, is not hurt by the judgments that are coming. They are sealed and protected. So, but now, these 4 trumpets, the 4 first trumpets, are like the signals to these 4 angels that are holding this wind, holding this judgment. So we see the connection here. Another thing that we will see from these 4 trumpets is that they can be, if you want, and many people will want to, they can be explained as natural phenomena. So you can say this is natural, this is not from God, this is just natural things. And actually that's not strange. It's also with the first seals, where you see there is pestilence and famine and war. These are quote-unquote natural things that happen in the world. And God either allows them to happen or he prevents them from happening. So here it's similar. They are more or less natural, the first 4. Whereas we will see next time that the other trumpets are more supernatural in nature. So there's a clear difference. And there is also a parallel between several of these trumpets and the plagues that God sent upon Egypt when Moses and the Israelites were in Egypt. So let's look at the first one. That's chapter 8, verse 7. "The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the 3rd part of the trees was burned up, and all green grass was burned up." So, something is coming from the sky. Hail and fire mingled with blood. And we see here that 1/3 of the trees is destroyed by this, and all the grass. So this has big impact on the world. I was thinking of this in the light of these fires that were in California throughout all of the month of December, and of course also in the summer. But you see what an impact such fires have. We have them, of course, here also. Almost every summer we have many fires, and you see how difficult it is to extinguish them, and what damage they create, and how long it takes before this is all restored. So you can imagine if 1/3 of all the trees are burned and all the grass, that's quite something. It is similar as one of the plagues that God sent upon the Egyptians, and we find it in Exodus chapter 9, verse 22 through 26. And I just want to go there and also to a few other verses in the Old Testament where we see similar plague, because there are specific terms that Scripture uses here. The hail, the fire, the brimstone, and the blood. These are specific things that characterize this event. "And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch forth thine hand toward heaven, that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, upon man and upon beast, and upon every herb of the field, throughout the land of Egypt. And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and the fire ran along upon the ground, and the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt, since it became a nation. And the hail smote throughout all the land of Egypt all that was in the field, both man and beast. And the hail smote every herb on the field, and brake every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail." So here you get an idea of the impact, how fierce this is and what a destruction it brings. And here you also see that God's children are protected, as we also see these bond servants in Revelation that are sealed. Why did God bring this upon the Egyptians? Because we see also there a parallel in the reason why it happened there and the reason why it will happen again. And it is, the Egyptians were very stubborn. They did not want to let the Israelites go. And they were pride. They were convinced that they were in power and nothing could break that power. And that is actually the purpose, to break the pride of man. And there is an even more clear parallel in Isaiah, which we're also going to read, that shows that this specific plague is used by God to break the pride of man. Pride is, of course, we find it throughout Scripture. The pride of the heart is one of the most difficult things that prevents us from surrendering to God and allowing Him to save us. Because if we are pride, we don't want to be saved because we think we can save ourselves. But in Isaiah 28, the first 3 verses, we see a similar thing, and it's connected with pride. Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with a hand. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden under feet. So here we see again hail, and it will break this pride. I was thinking of this quite a while ago. This event that happens during the tribulation period, this hail that rains down, you have to think, of course, also of Gog and Magog and of Sodom and Gomorrah. Gog and Magog is where I want to go, because that's what I had to think of. This war that is described in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog-Magog war, it ends because God ends it. And that was is for me and for many also one of the prime conditions to assume that it happens during the tribulation period and not prior to it, because it's really God who is intervening there. And how does He do it? Exactly in this way, with hail. And we can read it maybe in Ezekiel chapter 38. So the chapters 38 and 39, they describe this Gog-Magog war, where we see this coalition of Iran, Russia and Turkey, together with Sudan and Libya mainly, attacking Israel. So this is a future war that we, by the way, we see this alliance forming. Russia, Iran and Turkey, they already are in agreement. And actually, as we speak, last week, Erdogan went to Sudan, and he made also a deal with them. So that's the specific nation that is mentioned here in Ezekiel 38, the Kush, which is Sudan. And Turkey now made a deal to help them, and in return they got a little island that sticks out into the Red Sea, just opposite Mecca. It's now Turkish. So from there they can have a base there for their ships and maybe also planes, who knows. We see this war as being in preparation now, so it shows how true the Bible is. But in verse 22-23 of chapter 38, so the last 2 verses, that's where God ends the war. And He says, "And I will plead against him," that's Gog, "with pestilence and with blood, and I will rain upon him, and upon his bands, and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain, and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord. This is how God will end this war. And this is the whole purpose of these plagues. God shows who He is, that He is the Lord, and that He is in control and in power, and people should better turn to Him. It's a different approach, you can say, from the time we live in now, still, which is the age of grace, in which God shows grace. Towards the end, it becomes more severe, more aggressive, you could say, because the time is simply running out. Time is running out. And so this, you see, thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and all the nations will know. And that is what we will see before the end comes. Everyone will know. There will be no question about who is God and who is in control. In chapter 39 is basically a kind of repetition of 38. You find the same things, sometimes with some extra details, so you can find it also there in verse 6. And I will send a fire on Magog, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles, and they shall know that I am the Lord. This is the purpose. He will show who He is. And so all these nations, these powers, they come against this tiny Israel, but God is the one who will intervene. And you see this, and you think, why don't these people read the Bible? These people like Erdogan and the leaders of Iran, they can know how it will end. Why do they pursue it? But yeah, if it was that easy. So this shows how man's pride will be crushed, and how God will make known that He is in control. So it's a conjecture, but it's my belief that this hail is the same hail as the first trumpet, that it actually ends this war, that it's the same event. Because it's exactly the same description, actually. In verse 8, also in Ezekiel 39, God declares, "Behold, it is come, and it is done, said the Lord God. This is the day whereof I have spoken. This is what is being prophesied. This is what I will do." As it says in Isaiah, God is a God who performs what He says. He will do it. And so that's the first trumpet. And of course, many men will say these are meteorites that fall from the sky, and will give it another explanation because they just are stubborn in seeing God for who He is. Just as the Egyptians, it's the same thing. They also they weren't convinced after this happened. So we go back to Revelation chapter 8. The second trumpet, in verse 8. And the second angel sounded, and it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. And the third part of the sea became blood. And a third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed. As it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. It does not say where this mountain comes from, but we can be certain that, I can say that we can be certain it does not come from heaven. It does not fall from the sky, because any time that happens, it is specified throughout Revelation, and many things are coming from heaven: angels, stars, stones, hail, whatever. It's always specifically mentioned that it came from heaven. Here it's not mentioned, so this is, certainly not falling from heaven. So you have to think about, what is this? He doesn't say it is a mountain, he says it's like a mountain, which you could also read as big as a mountain. It's a huge thing that falls into the sea. and causes all this devastation. And I was thinking about what could this be, and then I had to think back of something I read years ago. Because there's another thing here. It says a mountain burning with fire. If you think of a mountain burning with fire, you have to think of a volcano. That's a mountain burning with fire. And so I had to think of something I read years ago about an island called La Palma. It's a one of the Canary Islands west of Africa. That actually they are waiting for it to break and big part of it to fall into the sea. So I looked this up, and this is an article from The Guardian from 2004, so it's quite a while ago. And it is called Hollywood Fantasy, ? Tidal wave disaster is just waiting to happen. It was waiting in 2004, it's still waiting. Scientists say governments are ignoring a threat of a piece of rock as big as the Isle of Man crashing into the Atlantic. So here you have your, as it were, as a mountain falling into the sea. A beautiful volcanic island in the Atlantic is on the brink of catastrophic collapse, threatening to unleash giant waves that will wreak havoc around the globe within hours. So this one thing causes destruction around the globe. That's the effect of it. And while scientists try in vain to make their concerns heard, the world's governments look the other way. Bill McQuire, the director of the Benfield Greek Hazard Research Centre at University College in London, said a huge chunk of rock, roughly the size of the Isle of Man, is on the brink of breaking off the volcanic island of La Palma in the Canaries. When Professor McQuire says it's not a matter of if, but when the rock plunges into the ocean, it will trigger giant waves called mega tsunamis. Traveling at speeds up to 560 miles per hour, the huge walls of water will tear across the ocean and hit islands and continents, leaving a trail of destruction. Mega tsunami waves are much longer than the ones we are used to. When one of these comes in, it keeps on coming for up to 10 to 15 minutes. It's a huge wall of water that just keeps coming. Okay, and he speaks about computer models that they did say that will be waves more than 100 meters high, 330 feet, that will hit the other islands around, and after a few hours also the coast of Africa. And then between 9 and 12 hours after this happens, waves that go from 20 to 50 meters high will have crossed 4,000 miles of ocean and crash into the Caribbean and the east coast of the US and Canada. Of course also in Europe, Britain, will be these large waves. It says the island came into the attention of scientists in 1949 when its volcano erupted and causing a huge chunk of its western flank to drop 4 meters into the ocean. And so they believe that this chunk of land is still slipping slowly into the water. And another eruption is likely to make the entire western flank collapse. When it goes, it will likely collapse in around 90 seconds. And despite the potential scale of the threat, little is being done to monitor the geological activity of La Palma. Only a few seismometers have been set up, and that's not enough to predict if this will happen. So I'm not saying this is what is going to happen, but it could very well be that in this judgment God allows this piece of island to break off and all this to happen. Why? Because these 4 trumpet judgments, they can all be explained naturally. Many people will say this is just bad luck that all this happens right now. As opposed to the last 3 trumpets, they will be supernatural in nature. So we can indeed look at natural things in our physical world that will happen. then it says here 1/3 of the sea will be affected. So I was thinking of this and looked on a map. How does the oceans look like? And actually printed in here the square meters of water in the different oceans. And this island is here west of Africa. So it would affect mostly this area, the Atlantic, going all the way up to the Baltic Ocean and down to the Antarctic Ocean. And if you calculate these square meters of water, it is indeed roughly 1/3 that is directly affected by this. So it makes perfect sense, actually. Also, all the ships that are there, they will be overthrown with these huge waves. So it mentions here 1/3 of the ships. And there's a lot of traffic going between Europe and Africa and the Americas. So it's very likely, actually. But it says gives some other details in this in these two verses, because it says the mountain is burning with fire, and 1/3 part of the sea became blood. Becomes red, you could say. What does it mean? If you think of a volcano, that's very possible, because if the eruption is underwater, then lava will be in the ocean and indeed color it red. Not only that, it will create toxic gases in the water, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide and other gases, which will kill the sea life, which is also mentioned here. 1/3 of the creatures in the sea will die. This is also something that has happened on a small scale in 1996 in Russia. You know it? Okay. Yeah. There is a lake there called Karimsky Lake, and in 1969, there's also an old article, but there was an eruption there, the volcano next to the lake. Actually, there was an earthquake first. The earthquake triggered the volcano, and after that there was an eruption underwater. So it says in around midnight, January the 2nd, 1996, after a powerful earthquake, Karimsky volcano exploded, spewing up ash and lava high into the air. Later that afternoon, the lake followed with a strong underwater eruption. Eruptive pulses from the lake ejected columns of steam and ash into the air. And then it continues to say, the enormous waves, along with the sharp change in chemical composition and water temperature, led to the death of practically all life in the lake. Researchers concluded in their account. So there are examples that we can look at where this has actually happened. So if indeed this volcano in La Palma explodes and also causes an underwater eruption, exactly what the Bible describes is what would happen. So it's a realistic scenario. And again, if we go to the Old Testament, we see examples, and we can also understand why this happens. One is in Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 25. And Jeremiah 51 is the judgment of Babylon. And that's interesting, because we find in the Old Testament Babylon, that's the ancient Babylon, but we find also in the book of Revelation Babylon, that is the future Babylon. Well, in part you can name the Roman Empire, the new world order, we would maybe say. And here we see a parallel between the judgment of the ancient Babylon and the future judgment as described in Revelation. So in Jeremiah 51, verse 25, it says, "Behold, I am against thee, O destroying mountain, saith the Lord, which destroyeth all the earth, and I will stretch out mine hand upon thee, and roll thee down from the rocks, and will make thee a burned mountain." So again, God uses a mountain, a burning mountain, same words, to bring this judgment upon Babylon. And when I read this, I had to think right away of Daniel, because he describes the same thing. When he has his vision of this statue, it's actually a dream, I think, of Nebuchadnezzar, that he explains, of this statue. He explains it as the different kingdoms that will rule the earth. And it begins with a head, and then it goes down to the feet, and as it goes down, it becomes weaker and weaker, from gold to silver to bronze to iron, and then the feet, the 10 toes, it's iron mixed with clay, which shows it is the same material, iron, as the Roman Empire, but now it's mixed with clay. It's the revived Roman Empire, and it's in our time. It has more meanings, this mixing of iron and clay, but that's maybe for another time. But what happens there, the destruction of it, comes the same way. And we can read it in Daniel chapter 2, verse 34. So it is basically the same thing. That's the modern Babylon, this revived Roman Empire. So what we just read from Jeremiah is the ancient Babylon. And what Daniel says is a vision of the future, of actually it's our time, and what we will see in Revelation. And so he says there, Daniel chapter 2, verse 34, "Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces." And so with that, the whole statue comes crumbling down, and it's the end of it. And the rock there is, of course, also reference to Jesus, who ultimately brings this judgment. But again, that's the vision of the modern Babylon. And here, where we are reading now, the second trumpet is, God is still warning. Yes, it brings destruction and death, but it's still a warning. The final destruction of the modern Babylon is, we will read it of course later, but we do a little flash forward in Revelation chapter 18. There is where that will happen. And we see in Revelation 17 and 18 the religious foundation of this empire and the commercial foundation. So chapter 18 is the commercial part of modern Babylon. And it says there in verse 17, it talks about the merchants. So it's specifically all this, the economy, the economic side of it. It says, "For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, and every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, stood afar off." It's talking here specifically about trading on sea. And it is very profound, because when John wrote this, of course there were ships that they were trading on a small scale, we would say, compared to now. But if you look today at the hundreds of thousands of containers that are shipped, and tankers with oil, etc., that go on the oceans, without that, our modern economies, they are dead. So you can imagine the impact of this plague when 1/3 of the ships is destroyed in the oceans. That will have a massive impact on the modern world. So it's like a foreshadow of what is to come later in this Revelation 18, and what Daniel had already foreseen. So, as with the first trumpet, man's pride is crushed. Now, also his economy is, well, not completely destroyed, but it's severely damaged, we could say. So we look at the third trumpet. That's Revelation 8, verse 10 and 11. And here you see right away the difference of the previous one. The third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters, because they were made bitter. Extremely interesting in this. First of all, there's a star falling from heaven. You always have to think twofold. Is it literal or is it symbolic? Some think everything is symbolic. That's an easy way out, but that's not correct. Here it is made clear from the context, from the explanation, that this is actually literal. The star here is not an angel, as we will see elsewhere, where, for example, Revelation 12. And by the way, also later in the sixth and seventh trumpet, there are stars from heaven, but then it's explained that it's actually an angel. Here we see that it affects the water. It makes an impact and it affects the water. So this is literal. And it says also, the star is burning as it were a lamp. So it's giving light. So you have to think of these light balls or meteorites that, especially the last couple of years, we see quite a lot of them. It's a star falling from heaven that shines like a lamp, or as if it were a lamp. And it says it fell upon the third part of the rivers and the fountains of water. It does not mention the seas. It says the rivers and the fountains of water. The fountains of water means the source of water, where the water comes from. So if you think of that, where does the water come from? From the mountains. From snow packets upon the mountains. That's what feeds the rivers, and that's what fills the lakes and brings us fresh water. And of course the water that falls down through the rain. So that is what is affected, not the sea. And this water is specific what we use for drinking. It's fresh water. And we don't drink the waters from the sea. We drink all the other water, from rivers and lakes and what we pump up from the ground. So, and that's why it says in verse 11 that many men died because of it, because this is what's drinking water. And it was made bitter. Now, why? What does this mean? It says the star is called wormwood, and then it says a part of the waters became wormwood. So the name is not really a name, but it's actually the character of it. Wormwood is a word that is in the New Testament only used here, but in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew that is, it's used 7 times. And the Hebrew word is la'ana. And in Greek it's absinthos. So la'ana means exactly this, bitter. It refers either to a specific herb, plant that is bitter in taste, but it's also used as a curse. So you could say there's a curse on the water that makes men die when they drink from it. What, again, I was thinking a bit further, why would John use this word wormwood? It's a very specific word. He could have described it in many ways, or just have said that water became poisonous, but this word wormwood is there. And it makes the water bitter, and many men died. Why would men drink water that is bitter? You don't drink it, because that's very bad taste. But so is it literally bitter, as we understand the word bitter, or is it poisoned? And I think it's the latter. There is an interesting translation of this word wormwood in Ukrainian language. which we don't usually use, but wormwood, if you would have a Bible in Ukrainian, it would say Chernobyl. And that is the Ukrainian name for what we know as Chernobyl. And if we hear that, we think of nuclear disaster. So it might very well be that the Holy Spirit inspired John to use this word so that we can understand that it's actually radioactive pollution of the water. And that you can't taste. So you will drink the water if you're not aware of it. But you will die, obviously. So that makes it more logic that many men die because of this, drinking this water. Then I was thinking, how can it only affect the sweet water, the water fountains and the rivers, and not the sea? This does not make sense. You would think if a meteor falls on the earth and the meteor creates somehow radioactive radiation, all water would be, and much more than only the water. However, if this meteor, what all meteors do, burns when it enters the atmosphere, and that burning process creates this radiation in the atmosphere, then it becomes a different story, because the rain falls from the atmosphere. And the mountaintops are also up high. So if the upper layer of the atmosphere contains lots of radioactive radiation, that will be in the water. In the rainwater, and thus in the groundwater, but also in the rivers, in the lakes, in the melting snow. There is another thought you can have, and that is that this star is not natural at all, but that is actually a nuclear missile. There is a reason to think so, and it has to do with the last trumpet. So we'll talk about this another time. This is possible, but then again, if it is something that God allows to happen, and it's natural in nature, as the other three judgments, you would think of a meteorite or something of that nature, and not a missile, but it could be. This bitterness, as I said, in Hebrew, it's also a curse. And it's specifically a curse that God gives as an answer to disobedience. And we find the example of that in Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 15. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will feed them, even this people, with wormwood, and give them water of gall to drink. So here you see the same word, wormwood. Depending on the translation that you use, of course, but it is the word. And here, in the context, it is judgment against disobedience. So you see that these different trumpet plagues, they have a purpose. Attack the pride of man, his security in his commerce economic state, and here the disobedience. Then the fourth trumpet, verse 12 of chapter 8. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. So here we see everything that provides us light, the sun, the moon, and the stars. All of them are darkened for a third part. Now again, you can explain in different ways. Some say a third part means that the day is 2/3 or 1/3 of the day is dark. The day is shorter. But that would simply make the night longer. And how do you then darken the night? It's a bit strange. So I would rather explain it as the atmosphere being blocked in such a way that less light can penetrate, and thus it is darker than normal, both day and night. And that is actually a very logical thought in line with the previous events. If indeed a big meteorite would enter the atmosphere, and somewhere it has to crash, it will cause so much dust in the atmosphere that indeed it will darken the skies. This scenario is well known, and also large volcanoes can cause this effect. It is a partial darkening. It's not a full darkening. And that makes it different from what is to come. It's like God is saying, turn around now, because the light will really go out. Later we will see in the fifth bowl, there is complete darkness. But real darkness. But that's here, it's not yet. And we can see also in the plagues that came upon the Egyptians, one of them is also darkness. That is not the foreshadow of this, it's the foreshadow of the fifth bowl where there is complete darkness. But we could go there anyway to see the parallel to a certain extent in Exodus 10 verse 21-23. And the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand towards heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. And they saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. So this is real thick darkness. That's also going to happen in the tribulation period, but that's later. That's in the second half, in the fifth bowl judgment. But it's like God is already foreshadowing what is to come. And you see this darkness is so thick it can even be felt. Except the Israelites, they had light. And we find a similar thing also in Amos 8 verse 9. It also speaks about that God will make it dark during daytime. But I believe that this is the darkness that is towards the end of the tribulation period. What also Jesus speaks about in Matthew 24. It says after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon. So it's not the same that we speak about here. We see for all 4 of these judgments that it is partial. It's always 1/3. 1/3 of the vegetation, 1/3 of the sea, 1/3 of the fresh water, 1/3 of the light. It's always 1/3. That is a common character. And I will explain why in a minute. We'll first go to the last verse of Revelation 8, verse 13. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. Here you see the clear separation between the first 4 trumpets and the latter 3. In between there is this angel that cries this woe. To the inhabitants of the earth. I found this also striking that this is specifically mentioned. How blessed are those that are not on the earth, that have been taken up and are in heaven, that are not inhabitants of the earth at that moment. The woe is to the inhabitants of the earth. And so you just don't want to be there when all this takes place. Why? Woe, woe, woe. Because of the other trumpets, of the other 3 trumpets. Because what they will bring is far, far worse than what these 4 have brought. And they have already brought a lot of destruction and death. But with the last 3 trumpets, 1/3 of all men on the planet, all people on the planet will die. So that will have a great impact. And so again, God is warning. Again, He's warning. So, to summarize this part, we have seen the other time this silence in heaven, these prayers of the saints, this almost as if God is waiting because he does not want this to happen, but it has to. Then these 4 trumpets are blown, if you will. And you see that it is very serious. What is happening is extremely serious. It is a lot of destruction, a lot of death and misery. But we also see that God is somewhat holding back. He still wants that people take the opportunity to turn to him. In all these cases, there is always 1/3 that is affected, 2/3 is not affected. So God's grace is still greater than his wrath. That is how you could say it. What we see is that God, in these 4 trumpets, he attacks everything that is, of which man thinks that it is. He relies on this. It's normal. It's always there. He counts on these things. The vegetation. We need vegetation to live. Not only for the atmosphere, but also to grow food. And when we look at Genesis, when God creates the vegetation, he makes man steward of that. And we are a very bad steward of the earth and what grows on the earth. If you look at genetically modified organisms and the mixing of seeds and all these things that we the burning and cutting down of forests and all these things, then we are very bad stewards. And we think we can just do all these things without consequences. Well, God is now showing that he is in control of this and not we. He affects the ocean life, the trading of goods. So these are things people just think that it's normal and it's all there, but all of a sudden it's compromised. The availability of fresh drinking water, that is very important. That's actually our prime means of, a basic need to live, water. So I was thinking of this, it's like God has given, and through scripture we know this, the water of life in Jesus, his son. People reject the water of life, God takes away the water that keeps them alive, in the flesh that is. So, again, he's showing something. And it's the same with the light, the regular rhythm of day. We count on it that in the morning the sun goes up and we have daylight. But now, at least 1/3 of it is blocked. This normal cycle is all of a sudden disturbed. And it's again, man has rejected the light of the world, the light that came into the world, the Son of God. And now God shows what they've done. And he takes away the light. And he shows them, you're living in darkness. And you're living in thirst. That's what we also see, of course, in Revelation chapter 3. You think you're rich, but you are actually poor, naked, blind, and wretched. So, by disrupting those normal things, God shows that he is Lord, that he is in control. Just as we read from Ezekiel, thus all the nations will know that I am Lord. And again, with the purpose that they turn to him. It is also a confirmation of the silliness, I would say, of man, that we even now today find every day actually in 2 Peter 3, where it speaks about the end times. This is what we live in now. When we talk about these things, about the prophecies that are unfolding before our eyes, many people just shrug their shoulders. They just say, well, you're just silly, and they move on with their lives. But until it all of a sudden all changes. 3 and 4. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That is what we hear when we talk about the times we live in, when we talk about prophecy, when we talk about the truth of God's word, when we talk about the fact that all this comes to an end, and that the Lord's kingdom will begin on earth. And people say, it's not going to happen. Everything will just continue as it is. Well, here we see that all these normal things, they all of a sudden they stop, they don't continue. And we saw, of course, a small example of this last weekend in Hawaii, where all of a sudden the missile alarm went off. There was a missile coming from North Korea, and it said on the television and on other media, this is not a drill, and people knew that in 12 minutes or so, I don't remember exact time, the missile would impact, a nuclear missile. So there was a big panic, and people tried to find some shelter, and others, they just began to drink and to do other things for the last minutes. But you see, all of a sudden, life stops. And that is the way it will be. Only without the alarm. It will ring. It will just come. So these things that God is doing here with these trumpets, is what I said also last week, they are like a wake-up call. And it's a very rude wake-up call. It's not with a nice music or something, but it's like you're in a deep sleep and someone throws water over you. But it's necessary. Because what will come is worse. But as I said, God shows also that He is a merciful God. He's just God, but He's also merciful. He spares more than He smites. 2/3 are saved, 1/3 is smitten. This pattern, by the way, of 1/3 and 2/3, we will see later on as well in Revelation 12, when it speaks about the remnant of God's people, of the Israelites, of the Jews that will be saved. We have the same measure, 1/3, 2/3, only the other way around. 1/3 is saved, 2/3 not. And so I will come back to that later, and we'll also make a very interesting connection with the lesson that Jesus gave to His disciples, the last lesson He gave with the 153 fish, because this has everything to do with this number. As it was revealed to me not so long ago. So we'll look at that the next time, or not the next time, but the next time. Important thing here is that we see the character of God as we see it also today and in the past. God loves His creation, and He wants everyone to have everlasting life. He doesn't want anyone to perish. That is the thing. But this age comes to an end, and so people have to choose. And as we see, the closer it comes to the end, especially in these 7 years, the closer it comes to the end, the more severe the shake-up is. It's like now or never. And that is the something for us good to know and to have in mind when we look at our unsaved fellow men. That is the spirit we have to shake them up. We're not going to use violence, of course, but spiritually, yes. Spiritually, it's indeed with force. This comes in prayer, but it is serious. It's a matter of life and death. And I think it comes out very well in these verses, how serious it is. Okay, we'll leave it with this for now.